Hello and welcome to this helicopter basics tutorial. The idea of this tutorial is to not just show you the basics of how to get up in the air and back down again without crashing, but also to give you a better understanding of how the helicopter works. Just to be clear, I'm not a real life helicopter pilot, as much as I'd like to be. However, I'd like to think I have a decent amount of experience with helicopters and flight simulators, and that some of that experience might be helpful to those just starting out with flight sim helicopters. None of the advice in this video is intended for real world application. So, if you crash a real helicopter, don't blame the guy you saw on YouTube, because no one would take you seriously anyway. In this video we'll be covering the following topics: controls, hovering, taxiing, transitioning to flight, basic flight handling, and landing. The helicopter we'll be using today is the Cabri G2, but the principles are largely the same for most helicopters you'll come across. However, developing the skills involved does require patience and practice. If you're completely new to flying helicopters, it'll likely take you a while to get a feel for it. I chose the Cabri G2 as it's fairly easy to get started with, and it's included in MSFS, so you won't need to buy any additional modules. Our setting for today's lesson is Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. It has a decent sized airfield without a lot of traffic, and it's where I used to practice when I was learning to fly the Huey in DCS. There are three primary control inputs. First we have the stick, or to use the proper name, the cyclic. This controls the pitch and bank angle of the helicopter by tilting something called the swash plate. The swash plate controls the pitch of each individual blade as it rotates around its central axis to create movement in the direction that you push the cyclic. Unfortunately this isn't modelled on the G2, but this clip of the Flyerside B47 demonstrates it very nicely. Next we have the collective. This looks a bit like the handbrake on a car, and controls the pitch of each individual rotor blade collectively, hence the name collective. The higher you lift the collective, the greater the pitch of the rotors, therefore the more downforce that is generated. This collective also has a twist grip throttle, although you only need this during startup and shutdown. Once the engine is running, you engage the governor, and that manages the throttle during the flight to maintain the optimum RPM. See how the pitch of the blade increases as we lift the collective. This increases the surface area of the blade cutting through the air, which creates more lift, but also makes the engine work harder to maintain the RPM. And finally we have the pedals, which adjust the pitch angle of the tail rotor blades. This allows you to counteract the rotation of the fuselage from the spinning rotors, as well as turn the helicopter in the right direction. Now let's take a detailed look at what happens when you pick up into a hover. I've seen a lot of posts online from people saying that when they try to fly a helicopter, it just spins round and round in circles until it falls out the sky and crashes. So hopefully this will help some of you better understand why this happens and how to control it. In simple terms, the rotors are attached to the helicopter via the engine. There are some bits and bobs in between, but we don't need to worry about that just now. When the engine turns the rotors, there's an opposing force trying to twist the fuselage in the opposite direction. This isn't a problem on the ground, as the ground provides enough friction to prevent the helicopter from turning. But as soon as you lift off the ground, that friction is left behind and the fuselage will start to turn in the opposite direction. To counter this, we just need to apply the opposite pedal, so in this case we're turning left, so I'll apply some right pedal. This pushes the tail left, causing the fuselage to turn back to the right. However, we now have the counterforce of the rotors and our tail rotor pushing us left, causing us to drift. So in turn we counter this by moving the cyclic a little to the right. There's our twist to the left. And now I've corrected it, there's our left drift. The key is to focus on an object on the horizon and try to keep it in one place. If you get it just right, you should be able to hold yourself still, in theory. In practice it takes, well, a lot of practice. I should also point out that not all helicopters twist in the same direction. The Bell 407 for instance twists to the right, so requires left pedal to correct it. If it's your first time flying a particular model of helicopter, it's worth watching the rotors during startup, and when you're ready to pick up, lift the collective gradually to see how the helicopter responds. The direction of the twist and the amount of correction required will vary depending on what's happening with the power. If you're increasing power, the fuselage will twist in the opposite direction to the rotors. If you're reducing power, it'll twist in the same direction. Generally speaking, small helicopters don't have wheels. This tends to be reserved for big helicopters. This means you can't just roll along the taxiways like you would in a plane. You have to hover taxi. This technique has all the complications of hovering with the added challenge of speed control. As your speed increases, you'll gain lift, but if you're not ready to take off, you'll need to reduce the collective a little. But also you don't want to go too quickly or to be difficult to control, and if you slow down you'll lose lift and need to increase the collective. And then, just as you think you found a nice balance, you reach a corner and have to turn. Again, this is all about practice. Pick a point on the horizon you want to go towards and try to let your instincts guide the helicopter. Be aware of your gauges, but don't fixate on them. And don't look through the window by your feet, or you'll go all over the place. Control your speed of the cyclic and your height off the ground with the collective, and try to keep breathing. I find when I'm really focusing on a task, I tend to forget to breathe. And passing out is a sure way to crash the helicopter. This may seem like a tedious and frustrating exercise, but if you get the basics of this, then landing will be a whole lot easier. The best way to practice this is to find a quiet airfield with lots of taxiways and see how close you can follow the lines. Also, try in different wind conditions too, and see how you get on. When you need to stop, pitch back gently and set the helicopter down. You'll probably land with a bit of a bump to begin with, but again, it's practice, practice, practice. Most helicopters are capable of vertical takeoff unless they're heavily loaded, but even if they're not, it puts much less strain on the engine and uses less fuel to use something called transitional lift to get up in the air. To take off with transitional lift, start by taxiing forward, then allow yourself to gain some speed. Once you reach around 40 knots, the helicopter should start to lift without the need for much input from the pilot. Once the helicopter's picked up speed, the spinning rotors start to act more like a wing on a plane and will generate aerodynamic lift in addition to the downforce of the rotors. The point where the helicopter is no longer reliant purely on the downforce of the rotors and starts to use aerodynamic lift is known as transitioning, and is the most efficient and safest method for getting airborne. I say safest because if you have an engine failure during your climb, you can still auto-rotate if you have airspeed. However, if you're climbing straight up and you have an engine failure, your chances of successful auto-rotation are much lower. Control inputs should be gentle at all times. If you just yank the collective up, your torque goes almost into the red and the RPM drops into the yellow. If the RPM leaves the green zone, you're going to start to lose lift. It indicates that you're overstretching the engine, and usually happens either when you start to reach the aircraft's maximum altitude, or when you're being an idiot and yanking the collective up like you're trying to do a handbrake turn. To speed up, raise the collective until the vertical speed indicator shows you start to climb, then pitch forward to return the VSI to 0, and your speed will start to increase. You always want to be mindful of your torque though. I've never managed to actually brake the engine on the G2 before, which is what makes a good aircraft to learn on. But in real life, as well as some helicopters in MSFS, letting the torque stay too high too long breaks the engine. And auto-rotating a helicopter is a lot harder than gliding a fixed-wing aircraft to the ground. When it comes to turning, the pedals may point you in the right direction, but if you don't bank with the cyclic as well, you'll just end up drifting along your original vector. You'll turn eventually, but it's much more effective to use the cyclic. Much like in a GA plane, you want to keep your bank angle under 30 degrees. You'll likely need to adjust the pitch and maybe the collective too in order to maintain your altitude. When in flight, the pedals are only really used to compensate for drift. For example, I'm flying straight towards this helipad. However, there's a crosswind which will blow me off course. So I compensate by banking into the wind. However, the bank will naturally cause the helicopter to turn, and now I'm flying diagonally. To correct this, I use the left pedal in conjunction with my bank to the right to keep me flying in a straight line. Keep an eye on your turn and slip indicator. If the ball is on the right, use more right pedal. If it's on the left, use more left pedal. There's also a piece of string stuck on the outside of the windscreen. This high-tech piece of apparatus performs the same function as the slip indicator. If the string is pointing straight upwards, then you know you're flying straight. A good landing has two key elements: a good descent, followed by a good transition to hover. If you get these two things right, then actually touching down is quite simple. Once you're in a hover, you can choose to touch down right there, or taxi to a parking spot before touching down. Much like taking off, you can technically do a straight down vertical landing, but it's both extremely difficult to stay on target for where you're trying to land, mostly because you can't see it, but it's also quite dangerous, as there's a high risk of descending too quickly and ending up in vortex ring state, or VRS. I'm not going to cover VRS in too much detail right now, but essentially it's when the helicopter gets trapped in its own wash, causing it to drop like a stone. I don't think it's something that's really been modelled on the G2, but it is on some third-party helicopters. Start by picking out your landing site while you're still some distance away. If you think you might be too close, then fly further away. I'd recommend using runway when learning, as it gives you a lot more margin for error, and progress to helipads when you're more confident. You should always land into the wind. I'll say it again. You should always land into the wind. While you have airspeed, wind direction isn't too much of an issue, but if you try to transition to a hover with the wind behind you, it's only going to end badly. For your descent, you want to reduce airspeed and altitude simultaneously. This is done by lowering your collector a little until the VSI shows you descending. Then pitch back slightly to reduce your descent rate and airspeed. Continually adjust the collective and cyclic to maintain a descent and speed loss rate that you're comfortable with. Ideally, you don't want to be descending more than 500 feet per minute, and the descent rate should get less as your speed decreases, which will mean pulling some collective back as you transition to hover, but not so much that you balloon back upwards. You should aim, at least while learning, to come to a hover with zero airspeed just before the point where you want to land, then taxi forward as needed and touch down. If you aim directly for your intended landing spot, then there's a good chance you'll overshoot and have to go round again. When you're ready to touch down, gently lower the collective while maintaining a controlled descent rate. Don't just push it straight to zero, you may be higher off the ground than you realise, and these things can be quite fragile. Once you're confident with runways, you can try for smaller targets. You can land on some buildings, but not all buildings in the simulation are solid, or not completely solid, so touch down gently and be prepared to pick up again if you start to sink. The learning curve for flying a helicopter is pretty steep, but when you get the hang of it, I really believe it's the best way to explore the world and is totally worth the effort. When putting this video together, I tried to think about some of the things I wish I'd known when I started, and might have saved me a lot of crashes. I hope this video helps some of you get started on your helicopter journey, or if you're already started on that journey, hopefully this has some useful information for you. If you have any questions, please feel free to add them in the comments below. And if you found this helpful, you can really help me out by hitting subscribe. Hopefully, as your confidence grows, you'll come to love flying helicopters just as much as I do. Until next time, fly safe, land into the wind, and practice, practice, practice.